Today, what I'm hoping to give you is a tool for listening that can actually built into lesson plans for you and I'm trying to share the screen now. Yes, okay. In the classroom. And because it's really, really easy to kind of say, oh, we should all be listening, but how do you actually create a structure for doing that? And so the tool that I'm going to be sharing with you today is actually about listening that brings then the potential to build empathy in the individual. I'll talk about that brain theory just a tiny bit, which then creates relationships between individuals, and then that individual spreads out and it becomes a healthy community in the classroom, hopefully in the school, and building out into the wider community. And I also want to say that this is for K through 12 and adults. I work with both. So I don't read slides to you, so hopefully you'll read the slides and I'll be talking about them. That just seems like a more meaningful way to perhaps do this. I can't see myself as I'm doing the slides, so I'm hoping that you'll be focused on the slides anyway. As you can see, the goals are going to hopefully move you to ways that you can work with this. But I want to give a tiny bit of history on narrative force so that you recognize kind of where we come from. And that it began in 2012 when artists and educators and activists got together and thought about what is the role of art, what is the role particularly of writing, but also all art in our world, and how do we show people that it is an active effort to make positive change. And as they were talking about this and experiencing the first story exchange among some writers led by Colin McCann, in 2012, Sandy Hook happened, and Colin McCann was invited to Newtown, Connecticut by a teacher there to use their book, his book, Let the Great World Spin, to begin to heal those children and that whole town. And so it started with educators, and I kind of want you to just really be aware of that, because we see this power to make change has to begin with young people. So these are the goals for today, and this is our motto, our mission, and our vision. And here I want to say a little bit more about why that mission has become fully focused on emboldening these young adults to improve their lives, communities, and the world. So at the college level, I am educating my students to become facilitators of these story exchanges. So they go into the schools, they go out into the community, but experiencing the story exchange itself emboldens your young people, whether they're in 2nd grade or 12th grade or whether they're adults. Our core themes, you can see, are obviously quite intersectional. So the identity theme deals with race, class, gender, but it could also deal with faith, and all of these things are things that our immigrants and refugees are dealing with. Environment is both natural and social. So that intersectionality across those themes means that in many ways narrative 4, to my mind, is made for our immigrant and refugee children and families and our entire communities. And in fact, I began my work here because Fargo is Fargo-Moorhead, so it's Fargo, North Dakota, Moorhead, Minnesota, where I live, a border town of a different type, is a immigrant refugee relocation center. And I've been here 24 years, moving here from Dallas, quite different. And I was stunned in the last 3 years, as many people have talked about, at the level of hostility that arose. And I thought, no, something must be done. And as I worked to discover what would best fit, I discovered narrative 4. And Colin and I are friends, and it was a wonderful thing to say, hey, let's bring this to the college. So what is empathy? It's like a buzzword, but it really, means much more than what it is sometimes given credit for. So I want to talk about empathy as not sympathy, but an equalizing of human value. And here I want to go back to something that we've been talking about, is that listening. And as David was talking about earlier, and thank you, Claire, that's right, it's David. I learned a lot from a philosopher named Emmanuel Levinas, who has totally made me rethink the way I think about other, the way I think about difference, all of those things. And Emmanuel Levinas teaches that we must stop looking for ourselves in the other. As long as we do that, we're still being narcissistic, self-centered. And instead, we must recognize that every one of us is other. And what we do when there's only one of something, when it is unique? We treasure it. It is precious. We can do no harm to it. And that is a critical part of learning empathy, is that there is no other Claire, there is no other David, there is no other of any of you or of me. And so we have to learn to listen to that other, see that other. And he says that to be fully human requires empathy, that it requires us stopping with looking at somebody on the horizon and saying, oh, that's a woman, that's a man, that's a black person, that's a brown person, that's a whatever, and bringing that person close and really seeing them, hearing them, listening deeply, intentionally, and then speaking vulnerably, being listened to. And that is how we build human relationship and empathy. So I want to try a little exercise here very quickly. You have a poem in front of you, and I'm going to, I will read this aloud, and I'm going to ask you some questions that you can kind of chime in on. So this is by a friend of mine who is an immigrant, Faisal, and it goes like this. My father is in the kitchen making a morning cup of tea, singing a song he first heard when he was a schoolboy, when both he and Pakistan were full of possibility. He claims his memory is failing, but the song rolls off his tongue with such ease I can't help imagine him suddenly transported back in time, when Indian films could ignore history and dwell on simpler things like love. When my father's song goes quiet, I pretend his silence is due to forgetfulness. I fail to realize that his eyes have fallen through the dark, bubbling surface of the tea and found, for just a moment, the face of his father, a man who long ago taught my father this song, sang it every morning until the day he disappeared. So I'd like to know, who do you want to know more about? How many characters are in this poem? And who do you want to know more about? And what do you want to hear from them? What stories do you imagine they might be able to tell you? Could you take a moment and just put that in the comment box or the Padlet? And I'm going to try to figure out how to see the view of that. So let's see what you've said. Yeah, okay. So some of you want to know about the grandfather. So you've noticed, you know, the 3 generations in here. Some of you want to know about the father and how the father's journey began, the history of Pakistan with it. All right, so interesting. I don't see anybody asking about the narrative voice. In this case, my friend, the son or the grandson. But what I wanted to point out here is that even within this one small poem, and we use literature, we use pieces, usually poems or short excerpts from prose, even quotes to kick off our story exchanges. And what we have to realize is that even sometimes when we're really close to someone, this is a son and his father, we don't know the story that resides in them until we take that time to ask, can I listen? Can I hear your story? And will you listen to me? And so that's a very important thing to remember, that we don't know the stories that reside in one another. And it is a privilege to come to know them. So we'll say more about that later. This is actually a little kind of drawing that one of the students made. that was his representation, Michael's representation of what he sees as empathy. And even with the spelling and the cross out, I just love this because he really captured an understanding of it. And what the students come to realize is that barriers are broken down here between them. One of the things we didn't talk about earlier with the issue of race is oftentimes there's a problem between our international students and our domestic students who are domestic students of color, whether black, brown, whatever shade we're thinking of in these days. And I'll look forward to the day we can recognize all of our shades and value each of us, and that is what we're trying to get to. So talking about race in this is a big part of it as well, our whole identity, and bringing down these barriers. So the 4 elements of empathy. So I want to say a little bit about why what we're doing is critically important. It is not it's a soft skill, but it is not soft as in easy. It is difficult, it is muscular in some ways, and the brain is completely involved. I don't know if any of you have seen these studies, but Harvard has been working with us for a number of years now, and we saw their studies immediately when we began this work in 2012 and became a nonprofit in 2013. So it begins with that gaze, so 2 individuals really looking at one another, and then comes this sustained narrative encounter, and that is the term that we've come to use here. And as you see here in the brain, I actually had to get the science people to explain this to me because I'm a humanities person, but those sections that are highlighted in color there, they activate during this exchange process, and they can even in the sustained encounter enlarge. So Harvard and University of Chicago have been working with us on the evaluation of what's actually happening. And why is that important? Because that's how we get grants to keep doing this work, right? And to tell people that, yeah, this is important what we're doing in the humanities and arts. It's changing us. It's making us more fully human. So I want to talk about the story exchange itself. It has 4 sustained parts of the narrative encounter. And the first is this deep, deep listening. Then comes the exchange itself, or visualization, then the exchange itself, then reflection. So that's just a visual of 2 of our students doing the exchange. So here is the exchange process. So just as we did today, we would start with some short readings. And following the short readings, then whoever is facilitating, so teacher, student, peer mentors, whoever is helping facilitate, 2 people will have already shared together, and they will model the exchange in front of the group to show them how to do it. Then the partners are paired and they go off and they tell their story to one another with this active listening. Now, it's very critical that during the active listening, we give ground rules. So there are ground rules for this. And one is, of course, social media away, phones away, listening carefully. When the person is telling the story, let's say Denzel and I are partners. If Denzel is telling me his story, what I cannot do while he speaks is ever interrupt. And that's a rarity in our world today, I have to say. So I do not interrupt. I listen very intentionally, very deeply, and I take notes, okay? Then we swap. Now, after each person tells their story, you can ask a clarifying question of that individual, but not a judgmental question. So here's the difference. You might say, can you remind me again, how old were you when that happened? But you wouldn't say, oh my, how in the world did you ever? There's judgment in that, right? You respond as a human, but you only ask clarifying questions because we're trying to remove judgment. Then you go away and you can do visualization. Now, I want to point out here that I've kind of put this together in a way for you so that you can see later where you might have in class and where you might have homework, etc. So think about that even before we get to that slide. Visualization is because we do all have different learning strategies and styles, and we need to learn how to use all our learning skills, but it really helps implant that partner's story if we visualize it in some way. I don't draw very well at all, but I'll try it. I often do a digital collage because I'm pretty good with computers, but whatever. Some people do things like knitting and sewing, whatever helps to embed that person's story. When we come back together, we then form circles, exchange circles. And now this is the critical part. Because what happens here is that we tell these stories in first person, seated next to our partner. And why is this so critical? So many things here. It is great to have green card voices, welcoming books, etc., that we can pass on and share with others, right? But so often, my experience has been that we ask, and I'm so glad that this was not the case. Claire was making a really great point that everybody's telling their stories. That is perfect. But so often I have seen that we say, okay, all you immigrants, you refugees, tell us your story. We'll sit back and listen, especially if we are white dominant members of the culture, right? We'll sit back and listen. We won't make ourselves vulnerable. And that is a power construct that does not create empathy and sustain relationships. And it doesn't then change community. So what we need to do is put down the distance. It is an enormous privilege and responsibility to sit next to your partner and speak that person's story in first person. So I would say, hi, my name is Denzel, and this is my story. When he begins, he would say, hi, my name is Dawn, and this is my story. Now, we don't own each other's story. We could never own each other's story, right? We have been given a generous gift of holding that story and sharing it and demonstrating to our partner how deeply we have listened. It is transformative. And we are forever bonded. But every person in that circle becomes bonded. And relationships then are forming. Some of the things that the immigrant and non-immigrant members have said was how surprised they were by each other. And I'll talk about success a little bit later. One of the important things that our immigrant children don't know is maybe the struggle of other children. And we too easily dismiss that all these kids are struggling with different things. And wow, what a bonding experience that can be. Or all these children have great joys and love and various things that they bring to the table that we need to hear from one another. So after the exchange, it is critically important that we have reflection. And we do the reflection in 3 steps. We take the individuals through reflection, a kind of a silent time in the circle, stepping them through how did this, where they started, where they are now, and then reflection between the partners, and then reflection of the whole group. So it becomes more and more communal. And then we have evaluation, assessing, well, how has this changed us? Okay, so some success here. Oh my goodness. We have had amazing success in the last 2 years in Fargo-Moorhead. It's been rather incredible. This bottom's kind of big picture is from one of the exchanges, the difference exchange. How do we each feel different? And we had ages 10 to 70 in that community exchange. So you see a lot here of adults because I'm working with college, but I'm also working out in the community. But some of these college students are the ones I've trained to be facilitators, and we've had exchange at Fargo South High, which has a lot of issues, but all across our nation. We're on 4 continents, 10 countries, 21 states. We are in the schools. So just know that it's just that my work kind of focuses here. So one of the things that happened here is we had a petition that then became a bill that was being debated in North Dakota to stop all immigration. And I convinced the man who began that to come into a story exchange. That took a lot of trust building. And his partner was an immigrant from Ghana, and whom I know well. And I thought that would be a very good pairing. And by the end of that, Damien was completely changed and withdrew kind of his whole support for that initiative. And little by little, we have been changing this community, monthly exchange by monthly exchange. And we now have our immigrants running for office, city commission, and school boards. And it is an amazing turnaround. We still have an awful lot of work to do. In the schools, stopping the bullying, stopping the kinds of stuff that's being written on bathroom walls. We've had hate issues on the buses. And so that is why it's critically important that we're in those schools doing this work. This little boy that you can see right down here, John, he had experienced a great deal of bullying, and he has said that Narrative 4 has made all the difference in his world, and his mother has asked the schools to kind of implement Narrative 4 as a regular thing now. So Narrative 4, of course, fits within arts and humanities and the social sciences most clearly, but you may be able to think of other ways that it fits in, but these are classes that it just automatically fits within and that we have lesson plans for. So how can you get started? These are the things that you need to think about, okay? I would be loath to say, here's how you should do this, because I don't know what you're wanting to accomplish, and this is a flexible tool. It isn't a solution, it is a flexible tool, one more thing for your toolkit. I like to think about this sort of in the 3-day kind of notion, and that if you think about back to the slide that I showed you earlier, you would have day 1, you would introduce what Narrative 4 is, you might show them some of the videos. We have a number of videos. You would give them their story prompts, which we'll come to in just a second. And they would go away, and their homework would be, of course, to start putting together their story. And so you'd have that initial writing, and you might ask them to kind of visualize their own story. Sometimes stories are built around objects, so you might have an object collection, an object that kind of maybe represents for you who you are. Then in class, the second day, we'd have the pairing and the sharing. And then you would go away, and the students would then visualize their partner's story, go over their notes, reflect on that story, think about how they're going to tell it in first person. Then the third day in class would be the actual exchange, followed by a group reflection. And then more homework might be reflection, revision, evaluation. And I got to thinking about what Claire was saying about the arrival story. I really think you could use this as the launching pad for the arrival story that then becomes written into the welcoming book. So that's something I'm really excited about and thinking about now myself. Here are some examples of story prompts. And at this point, even though I can't quite see them, I'll go into the chat. I think that will be easier. I'll come out of this. So I'm going to give you 2 examples here. These are lighter prompts that we have used, and I'm going to give you some little heavier prompts, and I'm going to ask you to think about, are there other prompts that immediately come to mind? These are some that I particularly use with adults in community, but they're easily used by changing some of the language. I would definitely change the language for depending on what level you're dealing with. And some of that language, by the way, is right in Claire's questions. Claire's questions for testimonial and for arrival can be changed into some of these. You might notice that in the series prompts here, I have one that's kind of neutral, this top one that I would say leads us to a kind of negative, difficult story, and one that is positive. Always having choice is important, not just one prompt. So let me go back one to the prompts, and I'm going to ask you at this point, and I'm going to escape out of here. Are there some other prompts that immediately come to your mind that you would want to perhaps use? Oh yeah, an artifact that best represents your family history. That's really nice. I like that. Oh, Janet's question will come back to about the therapist when we get to Q&A, okay? I'm looking, oh, that's lovely. I got it. Thank you. Okay. Yes, actually the clumsiest one is one we've used, and it's pretty hilarious at times. And I think it's important that we have stories that bring out all the human emotions, laughter as well as tears, right?
So I want to tell attendees, just looking at these prompts that we have on the Padlet, Either comment on how you think that would be appropriate for your particular situation, your particular teaching level, your particular geography, wherever you are, how you might apply that, or add your own thoughts on what you think would be a great classroom prompt, and let's generate some ideas that we can all share with each other.
Yeah, now I'm seeing them now, and there's a lot of good ones coming up. The food, the picture idea, when you realize you misjudge someone, that's a very important thing. Overcoming a fear. We have a number of exchanges that we do on resilience, courage, persistence. I also do exchanges called the Survivor's Mosaic, in which we do not focus on the trauma, but on ways that courage and resilience and help sometimes were provided, how one moved forward. Rather what David was talking about earlier, getting those assistants. Okay, so let me come out and come back to the PowerPoint.
You want to just maybe give them a couple minutes in the Padlet so they can...
Oh, sure. Oh, we're doing fine on time, aren't we? Okay, good. Yeah.
Okay, so let's stay in the Padlet. The link is in the chat box, and see what ideas we can generate. I think it's what's great about this particular webinar that we do is that as much as the presenters have a lot to say, attendees learn a lot from other attendees.
Yep.
So if you can comment on these prompts and add any others that you find.
Can they hear me at this point?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, I'm really loving these. I'm looking right now at tell me about how your place in the family, your number in the family, what difference that makes to you. As each one comes up, kind of something rolls away, but I think I said that pretty well. And traditions. Yeah. Oh, this is lovely. The best feeling I ever experienced was when. Now, sometimes when we do the best or the worst, sometimes students and adults will push back because they'll be like, I can't think of a best. And so you can kind of fudge that a little bit and say, tell me about a time when you felt really great, a time instead of the best time, or a time when you felt really, and so they don't feel like, oh my gosh, I have to pick the specific best or worst. Okay, well, I think we're getting a lot of good ideas, and my experience is that that usually there are a lot of questions, and I want to make sure that we have time for that, and also get to what to do next, right? So, so let me go here. So there are some links here for you, narrative4.com. It is very important that if you're interested in this, you go on and you log in, and there's no cost, and there's no, oh my God, I'm going to get ads forever. None of that happens. You'll get a weekly update of things that are going on across the nation, stories you can share. But then there are also, we have actual lesson plans that are templates that people could use to get started. And they show the outcomes and what academic standards are being met by those various things. So that could be helpful to you. Probably one of the ways to get started is to think about, okay, so I want to facilitate an exchange. I need to actually feel like I'm trained to do so. Do you want to get a group of teachers together and have me or someone else come out to do a training session with you all? And then you just take it, you just go, you just do this. Of course, you could kind of muddle through and do this from what we've said now. And if you're courageous, you probably can go ahead and try it. But we do have a very specific process. So we train teachers to facilitate exchanges, or we can come facilitate at the school. Sometimes people don't want to train, but they want to try a whole class or program, school level, and ask us to come do that, and that's fine as well. So thank you very much. Normally training sessions are a day or 2 days, so this is a really fast glimpse at what we do. So I'm sure that you have lots of questions, and I'm going to come out of here and see if I can see your questions and respond to them. I'd like to respond. Can I respond to the one that was asked about we're not therapists, so we're not that bit? right?
Yeah, so let me just let the attendees know the question was, while we recognize that we're not therapists, how do people working with story and particularly vulnerable topics or vulnerable populations know how to support participants who may be feeling overwhelmed by sharing, hearing, listening, being part of all these stories?
Right, okay. So, so that is a really important question, and I'm going to answer it in several ways, okay? So first of all, we have to, as teachers, set it up so that we make it very, very clear to the audience, our students, whatever age group they are, that they are in charge of the story they tell, that they are not being asked to tell a story they are not prepared to tell. Okay, and that is why you always need to have choices of prompts and talk with them. Just as we need to learn how to talk openly and honestly about race, we need to learn to talk openly and honestly about this is a good learning skill for listening. What is appropriate? What do you feel you want to share now versus what you don't want to share? One of the hardest things is knowing not what the person wants to share, but what the receiver can hear. And by the way, that is actually harder because the receiver is not in charge of the story they hear. The teller is. We just have to carefully set that up. But here's the other thing, is if we are dealing with a subject that we think is like survivor's mosaic, if we are dealing with a subject that is particularly perhaps going to, like our gun violence exchange too, going to create some trauma memories or make someone vulnerable, we always have a school counselor or social worker in the room with us during those exchanges. We always provide extra support if that needs to be done. Those are the rarer occasions, but it is always, this is why we have training. This is why we train you to facilitate in a particular way, because we are not doing therapy. And let us be very clear about that. This is not a therapy session. The whole purpose of this, the problem we're trying to break, is what President Obama and the former Secretary General of the UN said is the greatest problem we must overcome, and that is a lack of empathy. We can solve everything else, or begin to, if we will begin to value each other in a way that every person is equalized. And then we don't have these power dynamics, and we don't have this, you don't count, I do kind of thing. We can work through our disagreements if we value one another. And so somebody had asked, what is the problem you're trying to solve? The problem we're trying to solve is a lack of empathy. That is the problem we're trying to solve. Then everything else comes from that.
And looking perhaps at some specific populations like undocumented students, undocumented families, do you have any examples or an experience working with this, or do you have tips?
Yes. Yeah, I was conducting an exchange in Minneapolis where that was a situation, right? And we have to make sure that those populations feel absolutely safe. So, for instance, there are things that we do, like sharing of photos, right? Identity markers. We remove all identity markers in those exchanges. Now, I was dealing with adults there, and I'm not sure what the situation is when you have undocumented children in the classroom. I don't know that another child would know that that child was undocumented, right? Whereas with adults, identifying them, there's a different level of lack of safety there. Although now all bets are off. So I think that what we have to do is not call attention to that and not make it an identity marker. What we have to do is share the human stories without the labels. And that, I think, increases the potential for safety for all.
Thank you, Dawn. I mean, I think that's very, very sensible as well. We have a couple questions about those who may be apprehensive about doing this. Is opting out okay, or holding,
Yes.
Knowing a limit, having a limit?
Yes. Yeah, I myself believe that a child should always be able to have an alternative lesson if they want, or the adult. There are some who don't agree with me, who say, no, this is just something everybody should do. But the majority of us, including the team leaders, we believe there should always be an opt-out, right? Because this has affective issues involved with it. This is not just a learning a math skill, right? And so, yeah, I think that there should always be an opt-out. What was the second part of that, Denzel?
I mean, that was essentially it. I think
Okay.
one point, this is probably a challenging question, but before we go, if a program like this or training like this were to take place, is there any way to measure that
Yes.
more empathy has somehow been generated? How do you do that?
Oh, yes, absolutely. We don't leave a single story exchange without an assessment tool. And so University of Chicago has helped us develop those assessment tools, but they can also be tweaked to what the school wants. What is it that you're trying to measure, right? And so we can tweak those to make sure of that. But the actual empathy itself, absolutely. In fact, I wonder if I could even get to this that fast. Maybe somebody can email and ask me, but there is a PowerPoint that has within it a slide that my students presented at a conference this spring that showed last year's measurements for Infor International, the evaluation tools the University of Chicago ran for us, and what the difference was that had been made among all those. We also have, by the way, that's the quantitative. We also have the qualitative, which are testimonials. You can see those on the Narrative 4 page or on Narrative 4 Concordia's Facebook. But the Narrative 4 Concordia, the Fargo-Moorhead region and Minneapolis-St. Paul, our numbers were even higher. So we're having about an 80% change in evaluative notions of how the people who have been participating now think about who they perceived as other. And that is crucial. And that they are feeling more positive about their own identity and the identity of every person in that room. That's relationship building. That's community healing.